If the title of this makes you angry, you should definitely hear me out. Don't worry, I promise to approach this with compassion. A lot of people that I care about went down this road. So yeah, let's get started. Manosphere self-help slop gave a whole generation brain rot. And it was actually more than just one generation, but it surprised me how much the young people really got caught up in this. I thought we were passing the torch to the next generation to carry on in our mission in eroding traditional gender roles, tearing down hierarchies, normalizing non-monogamy, and legalizing all the substances that my generation wasn't able to. But no, we got the exact opposite of that. And there are a ton of different reasons for this, but from what I have witnessed, a huge piece of this has been engagement farmers that use the culture war to monetize anger while taking advantage of desperation, confusion, and loneliness that a lot of people are experiencing. This type of opportunistic grifting is a very old problem, but it has been given new life through the slop content that has been elevated by social media platforms over the past decade. A major turning point where this content started to get a boost was a controversy called GamerGate. It's actually kind of insane how significant of an impact that this controversy had on the entire political discourse. I'm sure that these sentiments were brewing in the culture for a while, but a flashpoint occurred when a game developer's ex-boyfriend waged a public smear campaign against her because he was bitter about their breakup. This snowballed into a massive movement of right-wing gamers organized against diversity in video games. In other words, they didn't like to see women, people of color, or queer storylines in the video games that they thought should be specifically made for them. Around the same time, there was also a major backlash to feminist critiques of gaming culture and storylines, most of which centered around the work of a media critic named Anita Sarkeesian. She wasn't trying to cancel video games or telling people not to play them, but that was kind of the narrative that was spread around about her. She approached her critique of these games as a fan, but also pointed out how it's important to recognize a lot of the chauvinistic themes that were in them. The movement that formed around GamerGate has since splintered into many different subcultures, but most of them see themselves as being a part of the broader red pill movement, which was a really wild term for them to appropriate. Most people recognize that the red pill metaphor comes from the movie The Matrix, where Neo needs to choose between red and blue pills, with the red pill showing him the cruel reality of the world that he lived in, and the blue pill giving him the ability to happily live in blind ignorance. This metaphor is powerful, and it can be applied to so many things about how we interact with society. The Matrix is all about these invisible prisons that we live in, like social, government, and religious norms. Tradition is another one of those invisible prisons, so it's strange that traditionalists have taken such a liking to the red pill terminology, especially considering that The Matrix was written by trans women. There have even been suggestions that the pill in the movie was red because many estrogen pills were red in the 1990s when the movie was made. But there is some controversy about this because apparently the pills came in many different colors back then depending on the dosage and brand. Either way, it really is insane that they picked up this term, because gender was definitely one of the social control mechanisms that the Wachowski sisters were analogizing in The Matrix. The whole red pill movement is based on the idea that masculinity is under attack and needs to be reclaimed. This comes both in the form of wanting to subjugate women like the bad old days and enforcing internal hierarchies among men based on strength and aggressiveness. But the real crisis in masculinity is that men who buy into traditional ideas about gender are having an identity crisis, and they're taking it out on the rest of us. We are told that we always need to be strong, aggressive, and never show emotion, which is very damaging. This is where the toxic and toxic masculinity comes from. Sometimes the term hegemonic masculinity works better in discussions about this, because while both mean the same thing, the term toxic is very triggering to some because they have had a lifetime of brainwashing telling them that aggression is natural and sometimes beneficial for men. I like to use the term hegemonic masculinity because it provokes deeper discussions and it bypasses that debate about whether or not masculinity itself is toxic, which is completely pointless if you don't have a clear definition for what masculinity actually is, but nobody really does. It's mostly based on vibes. Hegemonic masculinity is basically the mindset that men should be dominant over women and that the aggressive presentation of masculinity is the only true and legitimate way to be a man. Some men have a hard time overcoming this conditioning because they benefit from the current hierarchy that places strong and aggressive men at the top. Even many of the men that don't live up to these arbitrary standards still want to preserve the hierarchy because at least they know that they will have a default position above women. They would also much rather go to the gym than go to therapy, which is a serious problem because it leads people to believe that they can improve themselves while entirely ignoring their mental health. The world is changing though, whether they like it or not. Strength and aggressiveness are no longer as beneficial as they were in the past, unless you fall into a very small segment of the population who is a professional level athlete or a professional bad guy working for the government. I'm not saying that there's something wrong with being active and healthy, but trying to be strong just so you can intimidate people and using that strength to dominate others is not cool. We don't need to hunt wild boars or fight to survive anymore. Most of the jobs that require high levels of physical strength are increasingly done by robots. So while physical strength is good to have, it's not the necessity that it once was, and it has taken a backseat to intelligence and empathy. There's also this idea that a lot of dudes have in their head that they need to be some type of protector, especially with women. This is another one of those outdated ideas though, and it's pretty much a complete fantasy. In relationships, the protector role has become more about emotional intelligence and less about physical strength. After all, the most danger that women face these days comes from the men that they live with and the systems that they live under, which all too often work together. A lot of these guys will go to the gym and get jacked, but they do no internal work, and they continue to be the same hostile and emotionally immature people. So nobody is going to think that they're safe in any way, and they wonder why they're still lonely. That's not to say that women don't think muscles are attractive. That would be wishful thinking on my part. But I'm just saying that getting jacked isn't going to help you if you're clearly emotionally unstable. And you're not going to save some woman in a back alley somewhere. There's like a 1 in a million chance of that happening. The old way of thinking about masculinity is obsolete, but none of these dudes seem to be waking up to this anytime soon. And it's gotten even worse in the years since the red pill fad took over online. Now we have a whole generation of so-called Manosphere content creators that brainwash young men into a worldview that should have died off generations ago. The thing that makes them especially dangerous is the fact that they pretty much have a monopoly on the realm of self-improvement. If you think about it, this makes sense because those of us who believe in social freedom aren't really going to be telling young people how to live, because that's kind of the point. You should be free to live however you want, as long as you aren't hurting anyone else. We also focus a lot more on how to improve society instead of telling individuals how to improve their own personal lives, because that's really not the business of some stranger on YouTube in the first place. Plus, most of us understand that the systems that we live under are the root of most of our problems. Now, on the other hand, you got these guys saying that if you act and behave exactly like them, and adopt some sort of traditionalist mindset and lifestyle and hit the gym, you can become rich, more attractive, and finally feel better about yourself. Of course, these are most times false promises, and I still don't really think that there is a one-size-fits-all formula for success or happiness, so it's a really challenging situation, finding a way to counter these narratives without giving false promises or telling people how to live. If you have any ideas, leave them in the comments because this is a hard one. Anyway, when the culture war began taking over the online content algorithm, it seemed like my readers and many of my friends were split down the middle of these issues. Content creators realized this, and they did their best to appeal to both sides of the debate because they didn't want to lose half of their audience. I saw most content creators taking a position of basically they're both bad. I get this argument when it comes to the Democrats versus the Republicans, at least in the pre-Trump era, but there is no equivalence between racists and anti-racists, feminists and misogynists, or the queer community and their haters. The choice should be obvious in these cases. There's this thing called audience capture though, which is where content creators are pushed in certain directions because they can see what the most vocal members of their audience want. This ends up being a kind of a feedback loop because the audience influences the content creators and vice versa. They both increasingly push each other further towards fanaticism. If you are listening to a content creator for a few years and you become a fan, you may become easily influenced by their political opinions, even if it's something you wouldn't go along with otherwise. On the other side of things, If you're a content creator and you start seeing a lot of your comments going in a certain direction, you may have a tendency to adjust accordingly. I saw this happen a lot beginning around 2015. It wasn't just a matter of audience capture, but there was also the algorithm that was changing people as well. Once algorithms started to enter the picture, things took a very ugly turn. It wasn't that the algorithms showed people a limited view of reality, although that definitely is a thing. The main problem was the incentives that they created for potential influencers. Debates and outrage were favored by the algorithms because these companies realized that conflicts kept people on the apps much longer than polite conversations or common interests. The urge of getting the last word when someone on the internet is wrong has been the main attention driver for all of major social media networks. To make matters worse, this dynamic was very easy for unethical people to hijack. For them, the path to success was basically capturing the attention of angry people by saying something shocking and then giving them someone to blame for their anger. Then they just ride the algorithmic train of hate clicks all the way to early retirement. The funny thing is that these people always claim that they are being censored, but they speak from the largest platforms and have subscription revenues in the millions. A ton of censorship does happen online though, and I was actually a victim of it, so I know how this works. I was at the center of one of the largest censorship campaigns on the internet, and most people have never even heard of it. That's how successful it was. The government and the corporate class don't want people to talk about war, the military, the police, and they don't want us exposing corruption, and they could care less about hate speech in reality. The only reason we had hate speech restrictions online is because the corporations that advertise here don't want to upset their customers. And that's really just the signs of a changing culture. It's not a plot to shut down free speech. But before I get into all that, let's start with the social media purge of 2018, where the actual censorship was happening. One day, in the fall of 2018, I woke up to find that all of the media outlets that I worked for had their social media pages taken down. All of them at the same time, on both Facebook and Twitter, in what was obviously a coordinated effort. Police the Police, End the Drug War, the Free Thought Project, the Anti-Media, and many other pages were taken down that way, with no real explanation as to why. Even the page for the Free Your Mind conference that I organized was taken down. In the media, they reported a massive sweep of social media pages that were deemed to be spreading misinformation. Some sources even called us Russian bots. This event came to be known as the Purge in indie media circles. The reports said that the pages were targeted for takedown because of election information and hate speech, but we didn't fall into either of those categories. We didn't cover elections at all, and we usually advocated against voting in general, but we were always outspoken against U.S. foreign policy and the narratives put out by the U.S. State Department, and this is why they had to get rid of us. In the weeks following the purge, we learned that an organization was heavily involved in identifying what they deemed to be disinformation during the campaign, and it was all of these pages that I mentioned and then thousands more. You can see their name here along with a lot of their donors, but the robots won't like if I say it. But basically it's the word Atlantic, like the ocean, you know, and then right next to that you put the word council, like the place where they organize things. I really got to play these games to get around the bots. So this is a think tank dedicated almost exclusively to foreign policy and maintaining Western hegemony globally. And they took the purge as an opportunity to go far beyond hate speech and election misinformation, to overwhelmingly target anyone who countered the U.S. State Department's narrative on foreign policy issues. It's important to note that in the years since, the hate speech that was alleged to be a target of the purge has continued to be elevated and promoted on these platforms, while peaceful anarchists and people demanding an end to war no longer have a voice, except for some of the newer platforms that weren't around back then. There were hundreds of journalists who were affected by this, each of us having our jobs and platforms totally ripped from under us. We tried our best to get the word out and gain some sympathy from the mainstream, but everyone just wanted to focus on the conservatives who were crying about censorship even though they still had their platforms. Most of them weren't actually being censored, they were just being criticized for the first time in their lives, and they didn't know how to handle it. There were a few accounts that were actually being banned from a couple places, like that one ran by the creepy woman who gets explosion threats called in on hospitals. She's back now anyway. But if there ever was a legitimate case for censorship, that would probably fit the bill. Although I don't think that deplatforming is a good way to fight them, and it's a strategy that's mostly backfiring. But anyway, regardless, the message of hate that they were trying to put out there was insignificant and unimportant when compared to the real activism of exposing corruption in police departments and the military, not to mention the fact that it's entirely counter-revolutionary. We tried everything we could to get through to all the biggest podcasts, which of course included Joe Rogan. He knew about what was happening to us. Kyle Kalinske even went on his show and named a few of the sites that I worked for on air.
Speaking of social media, have you seen all these purges recently? There's a new round of it that just happened.
No, who got purged?
800 or more accounts were purged from Facebook and Twitter, and they're almost all alternative media accounts. So some of the sites are, Snowflakes was one, I think, on Facebook. There's another one called Anti-Media that was purged. They're an anti-war media thing. Free Thought Project is another one.
I did hear about this, and there was Cop Watch.
Police to Police was one of them that was pulled. So basically, and what they're saying is, they said, oh, the reason we pulled this is because it's inauthentic behavior. We're pulling these accounts because there's inauthentic behavior on those accounts.
What does that mean?
I don't know. That's the point, and they never clarified. So what I think it means is, hey, these are alternative media outlets, and we want to get rid of them. So we're just going to get rid of them.
That's
so
not good.
it is a scary time because you see that this can impact, really anybody who's not towing the line, if you will. Like police to police, are we really going to, do we really think that they pulled that down? Not for the obvious reason, which is that you're sowing discord and the police don't like it?
As part of its purge, Facebook has removed the pages of several police accountability watchdog critic groups, including Cop Block, the Free Thought Project, and Police to Police. They've also apparently severely restricted the activity for the photography is not a crime page. Huh. So, do you think they're getting pressure from law enforcement?
I don't know, but I never usually believe in smoke-filled backroom conspiracies, but they're starting to get hard to avoid because there's so many of these things, man. If somebody's doxing somebody or somebody's directly threatening somebody and stuff like that, there should be a process set up where you can ameliorate that and do it quickly. But having said that, people forget, man, the ACLU used to defend the KKK in
That's
court.
also what Ari brought up.
Yes, and they said, hey, in Skokie, they said, hey, listen, we don't agree with these people. We think they're heinous, we think they're terrible, we think they're dead wrong, but they have a right to say what they're saying because once you get rid of it for them, what people don't realize, Joe, is that these things will always come back against people who are powerless and marginalized. It's not like when you censor, everybody gets together and we all go, okay, so it's just the Nazis, right? Yes, it's just the Nazis. No, first of all, who's running these, these organizations? Obviously, they have their own opinions and their own vested interests and their own power dynamic issues, and they're going to take down whoever threatens their power.
It says all but proving the case that this was a coordinated attack by the tech giant community shortly after the purge on Facebook. Twitter followed suit, wiping out our profiles on there as well. They gave absolutely no reason for the suspension. So we had close, the Free Thought umbrella had close to 6 million followers. Wow.
Isn't that crazy? And they just decided overnight.
What's crazy is I didn't even hear about this.
Well, that's why I'm here.
Yeah, I appreciate you.
After getting that shout out, we thought that we were going to be contacted to come on the show at any moment. If we were able to get on a platform like that, we would definitely be able to get our pages back. That's not how things worked out, though. He was more interested in talking to the creeps that were banned for harassing trans people. Apparently, the right to harass marginalized people is a lot more important than fighting against war and police brutality. At least, that seemed to be how Joe Rogan saw things. If you think about it, that really is how free speech is viewed in American culture. People think that maximum free speech is having the ability to say slurs, but they don't even consider how they are prevented and discouraged from questioning any existing power structure or hierarchies, which is where the real power of free speech is. Rogan did have someone on to talk about censorship, but it had nothing to do with the anti-war and police reform activists that were actually fighting for freedom and justice. The ones that Kyle Kalinske told him about. The guest that he decided to bring on to talk about the purge was Dim Tool, the guy who is so insecure about being bald that he wears a beanie wherever he goes. But this was back when nobody knew who he was. He pushed the narrative that it was only social conservatives getting shut down, and that they were being specifically targeted. But this wasn't the full story, or even the real story. The funny thing about Dim Tool is that he actually started out on the left. He was a small-time content creator who supported Occupy Wall Street and was also getting pepper sprayed by the cops in Ferguson, from what I heard from some people who were there. But somewhere along the way, he saw all that fascist money flying around everywhere and decided to shift his focus towards his obsession with trans people, which helped him go viral very quickly because that's what a lot of people do nowadays. That was what he spent most of his time talking about during the interview. But at one point, he was asked about the anti-war and police brutality pages that were taken down in the purge, and he said that we kind of deserved to get taken down, and that we were getting way too much attention and making way too much money for writing about bad cops. So much for free speech. Of course, since Rogan probably hangs out at the gym with a bunch of hogs all the time, he probably agreed.
The way I'd read it, and I unfortunately don't have a lot of time, and I was flipping through something, I'd read that it was a lot of anti-police pages.
Some of them were anti-police, but I think a lot of them were not. A lot of them were anti-establishment, anti-corruption.
He was already famous and already had a large following when he initially launched his show, but the content in the early days was much different than it is today. He followed that similar progression that I discussed in my previous video. In the early days, it was a mixture of artists, musicians, comedians, activists, and researchers who focused on counterculture topics like psychedelics or aliens, and some of the more legit conspiracy theories. Back in those days, he was mostly known for asking the guests on his show if they tried DMT. Not exactly as right-wing as he is today. People like Immortal Technique and Alex Gray were the types of people that you could expect on his show back in those days. Then, slowly but surely, all of these puritanical right-wing culture warriors, like Benzo Kermit and the 40-year-old virgin, started coming on his show on a regular basis and were treated like royalty. Anytime some bigoted conservative got banned from speaking somewhere, he would have them on his show. I have faced censorship myself, so I understand the importance of free speech and how the slippery slope works. But curators like publishers and podcast hosts have a choice about which issues to give airtime to. There are tens of thousands of people putting their ideas out there, and a ton of important topics to choose from. Yet, he has chosen to curate his shows with the same questionable cast of characters, and nobody to actually counter the narrative that they're putting out there. There were a lot of impressionable young men in his audience who started to become brainwashed by the regressive ideas about social justice that were repeated on nearly every show. You would think that social justice advocates would have been invited to give pushback if this was all about free speech and the marketplace of ideas, but they never were. If he wanted to show his support for free speech by having a cancelled figure on as a guest after one of their controversies to clear the air and tell their side of the story, I totally understand that. But to have these people back on again and again allows them to dominate the public discourse with their agenda. It is also interesting that he didn't give a platform to drill rappers who were having their shows canceled at the time, or the women who were having their banking shut off from PayPal or Cash App for creating adult content, because their speech was clearly being violated just as much as the guests that he chose. People from marginalized groups who were being censored with serious life consequences got zero attention, while a few rich public figures who were waging public harassment campaigns got constant coverage. Now, of course, I'm sure that fans of his would say that I'm just mad that he didn't fight for the return of our pages in the same way that he did for others, or that we didn't get on the show, but I'm really glad that I didn't get sucked further down that pipeline, and AI probably would have taken most of those journalist jobs anyway. It's just a good example of what his priorities are, and I also think it was a turning point for his show and that whole corner of the internet in general, and I was kind of right there to have a front row seat at a lot of this. Around the same time of the purge, I was reading a comment thread on Facebook when I saw the acronym SJW. I had no clue what it meant, but as I scrolled through the conversation, I kept on seeing it pop up. I looked it up on Google and I saw that it stood for Social Justice Warrior. I was confused though, because it seemed that people were using it as an insult, but it really didn't sound like one to me. I was surprised that many people around me were hostile to these ideas, even people that I worked with very closely in the anti-war and police accountability movements. For some reason, they were happy to fight against the racist cops and the racist wars as long as you didn't talk about racism. There are a lot of these people too, and most of them call themselves libertarians. Many of them were so threatened by conversations about racism and gender that they turned towards traditionalism, nationalism, and the culture war. They all insisted that they were simply speaking up for free speech, but that's a cop-out. Everyone faces some element of censorship in society, so there are a ton of different examples of grievances that you can point to if you want to stand up for free speech. Even if you believe in free speech for all people everywhere, which I do, there are only so many hours in the day, and you will need to prioritize what speech you speak up for or care about based on your point of view and your alliances. Even if you don't think you're picking a side, you are with the issues that you choose to focus on. Nudity and sexuality is still regulated in the media like we live in a theocratic dictatorship. Any activism around foreign policy is always being suppressed, and there are constant pushes to shelter children from wide swaths of information so it's easier for their puritanical parents to brainwash them. There are people who think that you should be able to wage harassment campaigns online, but at the same time they think that nudity or even wholesome representations of gay relationships should be heavily censored and restricted. Censorship is pervasive in society. It's everywhere. The censorship that is applied to racism and other forms of bigotry is just one small area of censorship, but it dominates the entire conversation. When you take a hard look at people who are passionately defending bigotry in the name of free speech, you will often find that they only believe in free speech when it comes to their own beliefs, and that they actually kind of back up the racist stuff. They were never there for the people who got turned down for job opportunities because they had tattoos or long hair or piercings, but they always celebrated that the business owner had the right to fire them. But then on the other hand, they always seem ready to defend the racists that become unemployable because of their racism. Likewise, many of the politicians and pundits who were at the forefront of the counterculture debate in the 2010s have have been calling for students to be arrested or shot by the National Guard in 2024 for peacefully speaking out against the atrocities that our government and their universities were funding. Protests that challenge hierarchies get violent reactions from the establishment, but protests that seek to uphold hierarchies are ignored or protected. This is why the Klan and similar organizations have literal parades, while hippies are met with riot police at anti-war protests. Well, that and the fact that the police can't attack a parade that they're a part of. I'll leave it there for now. Please like and subscribe on your way out to help me get back into the conversation after so many years away. And please let me know in the comments what you want me to talk about next, because I've kind of exhausted the main themes from my next book.